thanks for the invite to speak. I suppose I wanted to start with, I probably don't need to stress this point too much, because I think it's obvious now, and it's obvious to the extent that even it's sort of drummed its way into George Osborne's surprisingly dense skull, that the economy's in a particularly bad way and shows no real prospects of getting better. There's a sort of vague bit of excitement today about GDP figures for the next quarter not actually being in recession anymore, and all that sort of clutching at straws that you get from the government over any tiny little bit of news that sort of alleviates the general gloom, that they'll cling on to and try and proclaim that the green shoots of recovery are on the way, that everything's getting better, that actually their plan is working in some peculiar new sense that no one's really considered yet, and that's the kind of story that they want to push. But the overwhelming picture really is of an economy where we live, that it is stuck at best in stagnation, at worst it's in outright decline. That's, for instance, the double-dip recession, the fact that having had a very sharp recession after the financial crash 2008 into 2009, gone straight back into a recession now, the fact that about 1 in 5 young people under the age of 25 are unemployed, that figure rises to about 50% if you're not white, that you can point to the widest ever gap between what we buy from abroad and what we sell to abroad. The trade deficit has reached a record high, the productivity growth has slumped, and you can sort of carry on like this with the figures for some time. You can then also throw in something I also don't want to particularly labour a point on, which is austerity itself and the social consequences of austerity. I mean, one of them, of course, is the fact that this is the first year that people are having to pay £9,000 fees to come to university. The 3 times increase that was introduced just this term for the new first years arriving as permanent EU students. That's one part of it. Clearly had an impact on attendance at university. The numbers are down for a number of courses in a number of institutions. It's clearly going to affect the character of how universities operate. There's a whole load of other consequences that follow from that. But then there's the more obvious and unpleasant social consequences. I don't think probably be hard pushed to find a week over the last year where there's not been some bitterly unpleasant story relating to the consequences of the austerity measures that the government is pushing through, the programme of cuts that David Cameron now says will extend essentially until 2017, and for reasons I'll come on to, will, other things being equal, extend well beyond that point. That was initially, of course, when they were elected, supposed to be simply a few years of pain and then everything gets back to normal and everything's going to be fine. An austerity programme that, if you take the total value of what the government wants to do, we're about 15, maybe tops 20% of the way through it. So we've got another 80% of spending cuts to arrive. And believe me, if we ever get to the end of that programme, if we ever actually finally come out the other side of austerity, then we'll all be living in a very, very different country. If you follow through on the kind of scale of cuts that the government wants to impose, the 20 billion that they want to take away from the NHS despite promises otherwise, the transformation of the benefits system, the clampdown on disability living allowance, the removal of disability living allowance, the removal of large parts of housing benefit, then at the end of all this, we'll end up living in a very, very different country to the one that we all went into this process with. Very, very large parts of the welfare state, of necessity, given a programme this scale, start to disappear. And most of the stuff that people would have assumed about the kind of world and the kind of country we live in, that it has an NHS, that it has some kind of measure of free education, that it has some degree of social protection for when you need it, most of that stuff just sort of disappears. And it disappears because of austerity, because of the programme of spending cuts that the government is currently pushing through. And the social consequences, I think, are clear. That, as I said, barely a week goes by in which there is not some story often relating to disability, which is, I think, being the cutting edge for what's happening at the moment, and the clampdown disability living allowance, where there is not some awful story about someone who's been cut off from benefits and has committed suicide. And I think you can find certainly one a month and maybe even a higher rate than that. I mean, the one that really sticks in my head is probably from about 8 months ago. It made the front page of the Metro, which is the free sheet. I think you probably get it in Norwich as well, actually, but it's a free sheet in London, front page news, which was a former soldier and his partner who was severely disabled. The benefits office told them they weren't going to be able to receive disability allowance anymore. They were reduced to absolute penury. They were reduced to a terrible state. He was unemployed, as a lot of former soldiers are. She couldn't work due to her disabilities. He had to go off walking 2, 3, 4 miles every day to rummage in supermarket bins for food. And after a few months of this, their neighbours eventually found them. They both killed themselves, because this is a totally undignified, awful way to live. They didn't see any obvious ways out of it, so they committed suicide. And one of the things that happens if you say to desperate people, and most of the people, despite the myth if you're on benefits, are pretty desperate, that we're just going to take away what little hope you had left, then you don't leave with much to live for. And this is precisely what happens. If you want a really extreme example of this, and you want the most extreme version of austerity, of the programme of cuts, of the restrictions in public spending, the real clampdown on people's living standards that's taking place, look at Greece. Greece used to have the lowest suicide rate in Europe, or thereabouts. Over the last year, Greek suicides have increased 40%. This is a direct result of the exceptionally severe austerity measures that are being imposed there. And Greece essentially is a society creeping towards total collapse. Numbers of young people leaving, unemployment going through the roof, the fact that people's wages have fallen 25–30% over the last year or so. You can add all these things up. I think you can do the aggregate figures, but the human story behind it is that lots and lots of poor, desperate people are suffering directly as a result of austerity measures. Those are social consequences of it. I didn't want to spend too long on that, because I think that should be clear to everyone in this room. I think everyone probably knows some sort of story, maybe not as bad as the ones up in detail, but at least would know people who've graduated recently, who haven't got a job, have friends without a job, realise the dire situation that people are being pushed into here. That's the social consequences. What I did want to talk about was the economic issues involved, because I think this is the clincher of the argument. Because for the last 2 years, we've had a government, coalition government, Tories and the Lib Dems, in classic fashion, entirely changing their line of this as soon as they got into power, as part of their getting into power. A government backed up by most of the media that has repeated a story, and it's quite a simple story, which is that the deficit, the gap between what the government gets in taxes and what it spends on public services is too wide. So the government's spending too much every year. And the national debt, which is the total amount of borrowing the government has made over time, is far too high. Because the deficit is too wide and the debt is too high, we have to cut down in spending. That will close the deficit and allow us to pay back the debt. That's the story that we were sold. That's the story that the coalition has tried to force now for the last 2 years. Nick Clegg repeated it almost word for word, and threatened dire consequences, by the way, if we didn't carry out austerity at his conference speech a couple of weeks ago. That's the kind of story that we've been presented with. And connected to it is another story, which is that basically during the boom years, so-called, in the 2000s, under New Labour, we just spent too much money on schools and hospitals, employing teachers and nurses and doctors. We spent too much money on all these things, and now in the bad times we have to clamp down on all that. We have to cut back in spending. What was Osborne's phrase? The credit card is maxed out, the cupboard is bare. Liam Byrne, that idiot former New Labour minister who is there still hanging around in the upper echelons of the Labour Party, left a little note in his desk at the Treasury saying, "Sorry chaps, there's no money left." You know, that's the kind of story that we're all told. There was money, we spent all the money, we borrowed too much, now we have to repay our debts. And that's the story that we're all given. Now, there's a number of reasons why this is complete nonsense on stilts. There is no other way to describe this. What we've been told for 2 years is a lie, and it's a lie at every single point. I'll start off with the kind of the bare facts as they're presented, which is, it is absolutely true that the deficit, the gap between government spending and government taxation has increased over the last few years. It is also true that the national debt has increased. None of these things have anything to do with public spending, with the fact that the old government spent a certain amount of money on public services. None of these things have anything to do with that. If you go through the figures, it's absolutely clear. If you take the average amount that the last Labour government spent as a share of GDP, as a share of the total economy, on public spending, on public services, it was about 39% of GDP. If you take John Major's government, the Tory government just before, it was about 40% of GDP. Over its time in office. If you take Margaret Thatcher's government, and Thatcher obviously is notorious for being, slash and burn and tear up the welfare state and all the rest of it, Thatcher, when she was in office, spent on average about 41% of GDP on public spending. So in other words, Tony Blair and the first period of time in which Gordon Brown was in office, but certainly Tony Blair spent less on public services than than John Major or Margaret Thatcher. In other words, less than 2 Conservative governments before him managed to spend as a share of GDP, as a share of the total economy. So it can't be the case that this sudden crisis that we're in, this crisis of the debt and the deficit and all the rest of it, is due to excessive public spending. Because if it was, that would already have happened with Thatcher and already have happened with Major. Blair continued what's been a long process in this country, like much of the rest of the sort of developed world, in which the government gradually claws back on its spending. And Blair continued this, broadly. The bit where it changes, of course, and this is the reason the debt and the deficit have increased so much, the bit where it all falls apart is the financial crisis of October 2008, September, October 2008, which, if you think back to this, and it's just over, I mean, it's quite incredible actually, it's just over 4 years ago. Lehman Brothers, at the time about the 3rd biggest investment bank on the planet, filed for bankruptcy. To cut a long story short, although I'll return to this point, it had placed a whole series of what turned out to be incredibly bad bets on incredibly risky investments. In the case of Lehman Brothers, like much of the US financial system, it basically bet on desperately poor people, often with no incomes at all, no jobs, no other assets, desperately poor people in the US being able to repay their mortgages, which is obviously not going to fly. If you have no money, you can't repay your mortgage, you shouldn't have been sold a mortgage in the first place. Lehman Brothers and all the other investment banks, including investment banks in Europe, Germany in particular, but also British ones, placed a whole load of bets on people being able to repay these subprime mortgages in the belief that they could manage the risks involved in doing so. This, unfortunately, turned out to be complete and utter nonsense again, and Lehman Brothers, as a result of the unwinding of all its bad debts, as a result of the fact that it borrowed so much money itself to repay these debts, filed for bankruptcy on September 15, 2008. Now, it's one thing for a firm in the rest of the economy to be declared bankrupt if it goes bust. I mean, obviously, supplies are affected, people get made redundant, lots of people lose money. It has some knock-on effect. If you have a bank that files for bankruptcy, in particular, you have one of the biggest banks on the planet that files for bankruptcy, because banks are absolutely at the centre of everything else that happens. No one can function in a modern economy without some relationship to a bank. Banks lend money out, they borrow money themselves, they're absolutely critical to what happens. If you have a large bank that overnight just disappears, it's like opening up an enormous black hole in the middle of the economy, and everything else starts falling into it. And of course, this is what happens. You get an immense panic over the period, over the week from September 15th onwards, an immense panic in financial markets, huge volumes of cash just disappearing from the system, to the point that, and it's not a particularly good book, and he's not necessarily the best journalist out there, but Andrew Rawnsley, you know, he's sort of marketed as a bit of an insider for New Labour, in his book on Gordon Brown's time in office, has a little account of the weekend after Lehman Brothers collapsed. It was filed for bankruptcy on the Sunday. So this is Sunday afterwards. Alistair Darling, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, calls a meeting in his office at number 11 Downing Street with the heads of the 4 or 5 biggest banks in the country. And they basically tell him that unless you bail us out, on Monday morning we will have to close down the ATM machines, close down the cash machines, and close all our branches because we'll have run out of money. People will go to the bank and the bank will have no money, and you can imagine the kind of social consequences that follow from that. You can imagine the absolute bedlam that would immediately happen on Monday morning if that was going to take place. So what the government essentially agrees to do is bail out the banks. What the government says is, well, we don't want that. And by the way, bear in mind, there's an element of blackmail involved here. If you're a big bank and you can threaten this sort of thing, you threaten it because it solves a problem for you. There's also an element of truth. I mean, the banks were really also in a bad state. But it indicates the power of these institutions. The government at this point says, well, we don't want that to happen. We will have to bail out the banks. We will have to cover up for their bad debts. We will just give them money. We will use our own powers as a government to borrow money, to hand over to the banks, to keep the whole system ticking over. And the total cost of this operation for the UK, which has an enormously bloated financial system, just ludicrously large, was about, and this is the Bank of England estimate, this is the one that Mervyn King, the governor, repeats quite a bit. Total cost of it is about £1.3 trillion. There's no real way to put that in perspective. It's basically the same as everything produced in the entire economy for a year. It's roughly equivalent to fighting the Second World War for 2 years. It's 10 times the NHS budget. It's an unimaginably large amount of money. That's one part of it. So if you want a story about why the national debt has increased, we had to bail out the banks. Government had to borrow money to cover up for the fact that the financial system was in a state of total disintegration at this point in time. That's one part of it. The other part of it, of course, is that the shock that the crash of 2008 provided was enough to push all the rest of the economy back into a recession, to a very, very sharp recession. If you go into recession, what happens to government spending is that it goes up because you have much more people unemployed, and taxation goes down because you have many fewer people actually taking part in useful, productive activity. They pay less tax. So, of course, the deficit widens at that point. You end up with a big increase in the deficit. So, in other words, the reason the debt and the deficit have both increased in the last few years is entirely due to the financial crisis of 2008, and not due to the fact that we built too many schools or hospitals and all the rest of it. You are sold a lie. It is a myth to say that it's public spending that has got us into this state with the debt and the deficit increasing. Just one other thing at that. Look, the national debt has increased. It's gone up from about 59% at the start of 2008 to something around about 81, 82% now as a share of GDP. So relative to the whole economy, it's about 82%, which is quite a steep increase, which is quite a lot. It's higher than it has been for a while. But it's not higher than it was coming out of the Second World War. It's 300, 400% GDP. It's not as high as Japan, which is about 200% of GDP. It's not even as high as Germany, which is about 83% of GDP. So it's higher than it used to be, but it's not so high that we have to busily tear up everything we can find in order to repay it as fast as possible. This isn't the case either. So you've got this myth about why the debt and the deficit appeared. It is not due to public spending, it is due to the financial crisis. It's due to the bailouts and the recession that followed the financial crisis of 2008. That's why we're in this bad economic situation now. You then got this secondary myth that the debt is so big and the problems are so insurmountable that we must repay it as fast as possible. This also is not true. Historically, for this country, not true. Internationally, not true. Nonetheless, you sold this. And the final bit, of course, is that austerity is in some way necessary. It is, in fact, and this is, George Osborne appears to believe this, that austerity is the right thing to do in these circumstances. That we have a debt, we must repay it. The whole country has a debt, the government has a debt, it must be repaid as fast as possible. That means austerity. That means taking money away from spending on things people might want, public services, benefits, all these sort of things people actually might want and need, and shifting it over into repaying debt over there. That's the net result of austerity. That's the meaning of the thing. And he says this is the right thing to do because when you have a debt, you must pay it back. Now, there's a problem with this, and it's a problem that ought to be well known. There's a library here. You can dig out any economics textbook, any at all, and it will tell you a story a little bit like this, because actually economics has known about why this is a bad idea, why you should never ever do austerity in a recession, why it is always the worst possible course to follow. It's known about this essentially for the last 80 years. It's been known about since the Great Depression in the 1930s. If you want a one-sentence story about why the Great Depression became the Great Depression rather than merely the quite big recession of the 1930s, it is because governments did exactly what this government is doing. They said, we're in a recession, the deficit is increased, the debt is rising, we must therefore cut our spending to try and balance the books. That's what they tried to do, and it prolonged the recession. And the person who is best identified with a story about why this happened, why the recession of the 30s was turned into a depression as a result of austerity, is John Maynard Keynes, who's a great liberal economist, who gave a pretty good story about why it happens. And it sort of looks like this, which is that it's perfectly reasonable if you have a lot of debt, or I have a lot of debt, to think, okay, I'll repay it. That kind of makes sense. You've got debt, the thing needs repaying, you go and repay it. Oh, fine. It makes sense if you're a firm. You have a lot of debt needs repaying, you cut your spending elsewhere, you repay it. That all makes sense for you personally, or for the firm individually. That makes sense. But if we all do that, that means everybody is spending less. And the problem, if everybody is spending less, and this is the problem of macroeconomics, the problem of the whole economy, is that if I spend money, it means necessarily someone else is earning that money. And if you spend money, someone else is earning that money. So if you cut your spending, someone else must be earning less. If we all cut our spending all at once, everybody else is earning less. That's a recession. And what's happened over the last few years is that firms and households have decided to pull back on their spending due to the fact they had built up a lot of debt over the years of the 2000s. And then government has also come along as well and said, oh, we have a lot of debt, we must also cut our spending. So in other words, everybody is starting to cut their spending. And because everybody is cutting their spending, everybody else is also earning less. You set this horrible vicious circle in trade. And that's what's now happening. That is why we're being driven back into a recession. as of this point in time. Austerity is entirely self-defeating. There is no point at all at which austerity in a weak economy ever makes sense. It is the single most stupid decision economically by any government in this country to pursue austerity in the way that it has been pursued. I mean, there's quite stiff competition for this, but I don't think George Osborne has much real contention now for the title of Worst Chancellor Exchequer ever. I mean, we will look back at this, if we're lucky, in 5-10 years' time and wonder what the hell everyone was thinking of, because it will look like absolute madness and insanity to start to do this sort of thing. If you want to see the effects of it, if you say, all right, austerity is just there to try and repay the debt and to close the deficit, what is the net result? The net result, of course, if you look at the figures, the deficit is getting wider, the debt is still increasing. The reason the deficit is getting wider is because austerity has pushed us back into recession, which means, of course, that unemployment spending has gone up and taxes have gone down. So by pursuing austerity and saying we want to close the deficit, you've actually made the whole situation worse. If you want a really shocking example of how this can fail to work, Greece is the best one going. Shocking in many different senses. Greece enters a deep crisis in October 2009. At the end of 2009, its debt to GDP ratio, the amount of debt it had relative to the size of the economy, was 130%. So total debt, 30% bigger than the whole economy, which is big. The Greek government, with the IMF and the EU and the European Central Bank bearing down on it, imposes very, very harsh austerity measures, as I've covered, quite exceptionally harsh. Reducing all pensions by half. You know, these are the kind of attitude it wants to. These are the kind of measures it wants to introduce. Sacking hundreds of thousands, or attempting to get rid of hundreds of thousands of public servants. Massive increases on consumption taxes for most households. All this sort of stuff takes place. Really, really dramatically severe austerity measures for the last, well, by now 3 years nearly. Debt at the end of 2009, 130% GDP. Introduce austerity, want to repay the debt, reduce the amount of debt. Debt now, as we come to the end of this year, is about 160% of GDP. In other words, the debt burden in Greece has increased as a result of austerity, because it's austerity that's worse than the recession. And when you get a worse recession, you're spending more on unemployment benefit, you're getting less in taxes. It is totally economically irrational. And this is more or less what's happening across the rest of Europe now. If you see the protests in Greece and Spain and Portugal, the people protesting are absolutely right to do so. It's not just a social consequence to austerity. It's not just about saying this is bad. Austerity will hit the poorest and weakest people in our society. It doesn't touch the rich, by the way. If you take just the last year, the chief executive officers of the top 100 companies, the FTSE 100, have seen an average increase in their pay of 16%. The average household income has fallen by about 5-6%. So most of us are getting worse off as a result, but if you're at the top of society, austerity doesn't look too bad. But it's the weakest, poorest members of society who suffer the most from this. So of course it's right to protest about the social consequences, but the economic consequences of doing all this are also pretty dramatic, and that affects absolutely everyone. That is the reason that people graduating from this university will not be certain of getting a job in a few years' time. It's certainly not going to be the case. It is the reason the economy isn't growing. It is the reason that we're all in this absolutely dire economic situation at the moment. So that's where we are. The question is, what do you do about it? I think there's a couple of things that are starting to happen. One of them is what's taking place in Europe. One of them is exactly the kind of movements that we've seen in Greece in spectacular style, now starting in Spain and Portugal, where there are tens of thousands, running to millions of people on the streets. There are strikes, there are protests, there are governments that are on the verge of breaking from austerity programmes or just simply collapsing and being replaced by a government that will not impose austerity, as is happening in Greece with the rise of Syriza, the coalition of the radical left there. These are big, dramatic things. Now, we are not suffering austerity in the same way that they are in southern Europe. Not by some distance, bad as it is, and worse as it will be from this point onwards, we aren't. But I can see that what we're up against is a government that is weak and divided, a government that, you know, one half wouldn't really rather not be in the cabinet with the other half. That much is perfectly obvious. A government that has lurched from crisis to crisis virtually since it got into office. A government that is steadily losing the argument about austerity, I think, and has been, at least with a minority of the public, ever since the student protests of late 2010. That really was a blow to much of this argument, that he's losing the argument about austerity with the public, and he's weak and divided, and that ultimately, you know, David Cameron, he's not Margaret Thatcher, he's not some heroic class warrior for the wrong side. He's You can look at the guide, it's perfectly obvious that this is a weak, divided government, but our side also remains weak and divided. That we've spent too long, I think, for the last few years, partly out of necessity, partly out of bloody-mindedness. We spent too long essentially fighting lots and lots of separate battles, some of which are where I live in Lambeth. Children's services were going to be really quite dramatically clamped down on. There were protests, there was a threat of a strike, the council backed away from that. Library closures. Lots of libraries have closed, lots have been saved, precisely because people have protested and fought against this. But we can't just win individual separate battles, because of course if you defend your library, they'll close the one down the road from you. If you stop your children's services going, they'll take them away somewhere else. This is an entire national offensive that we're up against, and therefore you need a national response. So there's a couple of parts to that. One of them, and the reason the coalition of resistance was set up now 2 years ago, was to try and pull together the different protests that are taking place, to say to everyone, all right, there are all these individual bits of austerity that we're suffering from, but we are a lot stronger against fundamentally a weak government. If we stand on the same side and we argue more or less the same thing and we all march in roughly the same direction, that's the idea. The second part, of course, is the demonstration that the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, has called for the 20th of October, which I think is absolutely critical, because what's happened over the last year, since the demonstrations of 2011 and since a series of strikes of 2011, is that I don't think there has been the opportunity to get everyone in the same place and say visibly and graphically that if you've got 300, 400, 500,000 people or more on the streets of London, you go from being a bunch of people complaining about something in your own individual areas and you turn into a national political force. You turn into something that the government finds very, very hard to get around and to argue away. And particularly at a point like this, when the economic news is so obviously running against it, when it's so obviously the case that George Osborne is a failure of a chancellor, the coalition is a failure of a government on its critical issue of the economy, that to get that number of people out there who say, we're opposed to austerity, stop the cuts, this turns us from being a bunch of people who complain about things into a meaningful political force, and it starts to make a difference. It pulls everything together, it opens a way for an alternative. I'll leave it on that.
Okay, thanks very much, James. Thank you.